There's something that happens before you even realize it's happening. You walk into a room. You sit across from someone at a table. You scroll past a name you recognize. And somewhere, quietly, without asking your permission, your mind has already begun. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It simply starts measuring, comparing, calculating something you never agreed to calculate. It's not a flaw. It's not a wound. It's something far more ordinary than that. It's the way the mind has always worked, long before screens existed, long before likes and follower counts, in quiet kitchens, in crowded markets, in the pause between two people's eyes meeting across a room, the comparison reflex. You felt it. Everyone has. Most people just never say so. If any part of this feels familiar to you, you're not alone. And if you ever feel like sharing your experience, the comments are open. The mind compares even before you realize you're comparing. There's a moment, so brief it barely registers, that happens before conscious thought arrives, before you form an opinion, before you decide how you feel, before you even recognize a face clearly. The mind has already done something. It has already placed two things side by side and begun to read the distance between them. It happens in the body before it happens in the mind. A slight shift in breathing, a subtle change in posture, something that tightens or loosens or goes very still. You might call it a feeling. But it started as a calculation, one that ran its course without ever asking for your involvement. This is not something people learn. It's something people arrive with. The architecture of comparison was built long before language, long before memory, long before you had words to describe what you were doing. It was a tool for navigation, for survival, for understanding where you stood in a world that was always in motion around you. And so, before you ever think I'm comparing myself right now, it's already done. The thought you catch is never the first one. It's only the one that surfaced long enough for you to notice. Every achievement of others silently becomes a mirror of your own life. Someone tells you good news, a promotion, a move to a new city, something they've built or found or finally finished, and you smile, genuinely, perhaps. You say the right words. You mean them even, but underneath that, in a place too quiet to be called a thought, something else is already happening. The mind takes their news and holds it up, not to judge them, not out of envy, exactly, but because the brain doesn't receive information in isolation. It receives it in context, and the context is always, quietly, you. Their story becomes a kind of mirror, and the mirror doesn't ask for permission before showing you your own reflection. What you see there isn't always uncomfortable. Sometimes the reflection is warm. It reminds you of something you've already done, something you're proud of, something that belongs to you. But other times, the mirror catches an angle you weren't ready to see, a path not taken, a timeline that looks different from theirs, a version of a life that exists somewhere in the space between what is and what you once imagined. This is not jealousy. It is not small. It is the mind doing what it was built to do, locating itself in the world by reading the world around it. The mirror doesn't appear because something is wrong with you. It appears because you're paying attention. The brain doesn't compare facts. It compares sensations and invented stories. Here is something the mind never tells you while it's happening. When it compares, it is not working with reality. It is not measuring what is actually true about another person's life, their private doubts, their quiet struggles, the cost of what they carry. It is working with an impression, a surface, a story it assembled in seconds and decided was complete. You see the result, never the process. You see the finished thing, the relationship, the achievement, the calm exterior, and the mind accepts that image as the whole truth. It doesn't search for the parts that are hidden. It doesn't ask what was sacrificed, what were lost, what happened behind closed doors when no one is watching. It takes the visible and builds a narrative around it, quickly, and without question. And on the other side of that comparison sits your own life, which you know from the inside. Every hesitation, every unfinished thing, every moment of doubt that never made it into any version of you that other people see. The mind places their curated surface against your unfiltered interior and calls that a fair comparison. It never is. The comparison was never between two real lives. It was between a story you told about them and a story you told about yourself. Both were invented, both incomplete. And yet the feeling that follows feels entirely real, because to the mind, the story and the truth have always been the same thing. You never compare yourself to someone who is below you, always to someone who seems to be above you. Notice the direction. Notice how the mind never reaches downward when it measures. It doesn't find the person who is struggling more, who has less, who is further behind, and use them as the reference point. It always looks up, always forward, always toward whoever appears to be standing on higher ground. This isn't cruelty. It isn't arrogance. It's something quieter and more automatic than either of those things. The mind orients itself by what it hasn't reached yet, because that's where it believes the useful information lives. What's already behind you feels settled. What's ahead of you feels like data, and so the gaze moves upward, almost on instinct, toward whoever seems to have what the mind has decided it still needs. But there's something worth sitting with here. The person you compare yourself to is never chosen randomly. The mind doesn't stop at just anyone who appears to be ahead. It stops at someone specific, someone whose life touches something in you that still feels unresolved. The comparison stings in a particular way because it lands on a particular place, and that place was already tender before the comparison ever began. The direction of the gaze, then, is not really about the other person. It never was. It's a map of something internal, a quiet inventory of what the mind still believes is missing. And like all maps, it says far more about where you are than about where anyone else has gone. The comparison doesn't start on social media. It starts the second you walk into a room. There is a habit so old it has no origin story. Before the first screen ever lit up, before the first image was ever curated and shared, human beings were already doing this. Walking into a space and reading it, scanning faces, registering who was there, how they carried themselves, what the room seemed to say about each of them. The comparison reflex didn't need technology to exist. It only needed other people. You've felt it in the body before the mind catches up. The way something shifts the moment you step into a gathering, a dinner, a meeting, a waiting room where strangers sit in silence. Something in you quietly takes inventory, not aggressively, not consciously even, but the reading has already begun. The mind is already placing you somewhere inside the geometry of the room. It happens in the smallest moments too. A passing comment about someone's work, a photograph on a wall, an offhand mention of where someone has been, what they've built, how their life has moved. The trigger doesn't need to be dramatic. The mind doesn't require a full presentation. A single detail is enough, and from that detail, it constructs everything else it needs to begin measuring. This is why removing the apps, closing the screen, stepping away from the feed sometimes changes less than expected. The mechanism was never in the phone. The phone only gave it a new room to walk into. The reflex itself was always already there, waiting quietly at the threshold of every space where other human lives become briefly visible. There's an inner voice that's constantly doing calculations, and you rarely question it. It runs in the background the way certain sounds run in the background. The hum of something electrical, the rhythm of traffic outside a window. You stop hearing it not because it stopped, but because the mind learned to absorb it into the ordinary texture of a day. Internal accounting, the quiet telling of where du blevet tu y voir, wavent, It happens beneath most thoughts, beneath most conversations, beneath most moments that feel entirely unrelated to comparison at all. And the voice is patient. It doesn't need your full attention to do its work. It operates in the margins, in the pause between one task and the next, in the silence that opens up during a commute, in the odd stillness that sometimes arrives just before sleep. Those are the moments when the background hum becomes briefly audible, when the accounting surfaces just long enough for you to catch a fragment of it before the day moves on and covers it again. What's rarely examined is not the voice itself, but the authority it carries. The calculations it produces are accepted almost without review. The conclusions it reaches about where you stand, about what your progress means, about whether you are ahead or behind some unnamed schedule, land with a weight that feels like fact, not like opinion, not like one possible interpretation among many, like fact. And yet no one assigned this voice its role. No one handed it the metrics it uses or approved the timeline it measures against. It built its own system quietly over years from fragments of overheard expectations and half-remembered comparisons, and it has been running that system ever since, faithful, tireless, and almost never questioned. What you admire in others almost always reveals what you haven't yet allowed yourself to want. There is a particular quality to certain kinds of admiration, not the easy kind, the appreciation of something entirely foreign, something that belongs to a world you never imagined for yourself. That kind moves through you lightly, without residue. But there is another kind, the kind that lingers, the kind that returns uninvited, days later, attached to a name or an image or a detail you didn't expect to remember. That kind is carrying something else entirely. The mind doesn't fixate on what is truly irrelevant to it. Attention is not random. When something in another person's life catches and holds, a way they speak, a choice they made, a life they seem to be living without apology, the pull is rarely about them. It is about something in you that recognized itself in what it was looking at. Something that said, quietly and without ceremony, that is something I understand from the inside. But recognition and permission are not the same thing. You can know what you want long before you allow yourself to want it openly. The wanting can live for years in the form of admiration, directed outward, attached to someone else's life, experienced as appreciation rather than desire. It feels safer that way, less exposed, less vulnerable to the particular disappointment that comes from wanting something specific and not yet having it. So the admiration that lingers is worth sitting with slowly, not to analyze it, not to extract a lesson from it, but simply to let it be seen clearly, because what moves you in someone else's story is rarely about them. It is a quiet signal from a part of you that has been waiting patiently for the rest of you to catch up. The mind measures value with rulers that no one consciously chose. À some point, without ceremony, without a conversation you remember having, the mind acquired its measuring tools. A set of standards, a system of values arranged in a particular order, a sense of what counts as progress and what doesn't, what qualifies as enough and what falls short. And from that point forward, it applied those tools consistently, measuring everything that passed through it against a scale it never once stopped to examine. The scale feels personal because it lives inside you, but most of its contents arrived from elsewhere, from rooms you sat in as a child, half listening to adults speak about other adults, from the particular things that were praised and the particular things that were passed over in silence, from a culture that was already in motion long before you entered it, already decided about what mattered, already running its own quiet hierarchy of worth. You inherited the ruler, you didn't design it, and yet it measures with such confidence. It produces its verdicts: behind, ahead, enough, not enough, with the certainty of something that was carefully chosen rather than quietly absorbed. The mind doesn't announce that it's using an inherited system. It simply uses it and presents the results as truth, and moves on before you have time to ask where the standard came from or whether it was ever really yours to begin with. This is perhaps the most silent part of the whole mechanism. Not the comparing itself, but the unquestioned authority of the scale, the way the measurement feels objective when it is anything but, the way a ruler that was handed to you by the world can feel, after enough years, like something you built yourself in a moment of clear and careful thought. Comparing people silently is a form of internal dialogue that most people never admit to having. There is a conversation that happens in almost every mind, almost every day, that almost no one ever mentions out loud, not because it is shameful exactly, but because it exists in a register that feels too private, too revealing, too close to something that might be misunderstood if it ever found its way into words. And so it stays where it began: interior, quiet, conducted entirely without witnesses. It has the structure of a conversation. There is a back and forth, a statement and a response, a question that arrives and an answer the mind produces before the question is even fully formed. They have this. You don't. They got there first. T dialogue. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It runs its course in the space between two ordinary moments and leaves something behind, a residue of feeling that you carry into the next part of your day without quite knowing where it came from. What makes it a conversation rather than simply a thought is that it involves more than one voice. There is the voice that observes, a calm, almost clinical, noting what it sees. And there is the voice that responds, the one that takes the observation personally, that feels the weight of it, that carries the emotional charge of what the comparison means. These two voices have been in dialogue for years. Most people have never formally introduced them. And the reason this conversation rarely gets admitted, even to oneself, is that admitting it requires acknowledging something uncomfortable. Not that you compare, but you care. That somewhere beneath the composure, beneath the genuine happiness for others, beneath the reasonable and measured exterior, there is a part of you that is still keeping score, not out of malice, simply out of being human and alive and paying attention to a world that never stops moving around you. The comparison reflex disappears when you stop pretending it doesn't exist. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from comparing itself, but from the effort of pretending it isn't happening, the quiet performance of indifference, the practiced ease of someone who has decided somewhere along the way that noticing these things means something unflattering about them. And so the reflex continues, but now it carries an extra weight, the weight of its own denial, because the mind doesn't stop doing what it does simply because you've decided not to look. The comparison runs whether you acknowledge it or not. The voice continues its accounting whether you admit to hearing it or not. The only thing that changes when you refuse to see it is that you lose the ability to meet it with any kind of clarity. It operates in the dark, unchallenged, producing its verdicts without any of them ever being examined or questioned or simply allowed to pass through without damage. But something shifts when the pretending stops, not dramatically, not all at once. It begins as something small, a moment of honest recognition, a quiet admission to no one in particular that yes, tiapned, and yes, it lands somewhere, and yes, that is allowed. The reflex doesn't disappear at that moment, but it loses a certain power it only ever had because it was being kept secret, even from yourself. What remains, once the denial is set down, is something surprisingly ordinary. A mind doing what minds have always done, measuring, comparing, locating itself in the world. not a flaw to be corrected, not a wound to be healed, simply a feature of being human, one that asks not to be eliminated, but only to be seen, clearly, calmly, and without the additional suffering of pretending it was never there at all. The mind that compares is not a broken mind. It never was. It is a mind that is paying attention to the world around it, to the distance between where it stands and where it imagines it could stand, to the quiet and persistent question of what it means to be here, living this particular life at this particular moment in time. You've been doing this your entire life, in rooms long before you remember them, in conversations that left something behind without you knowing why, in the small hours of ordinary days when the accounting surfaced briefly and then disappeared again beneath the rhythm of everything else. It was never a sign that something was wrong. It was a sign that you were present, that you were alive to the world in the way that human beings have always been alive to it. What changes is not the reflex. What changes is the relationship to it. The moment you stop treating it as an enemy to be defeated or a secret to be kept, it becomes something far more manageable, a familiar presence, recognized and named, moving through you the way weather moves through an open landscape. It arrives. You notice it on dit pass, because things that are seen clearly rarely need to stay longer than they are useful. There is something almost peaceful in that, in the recognition that this is not yours alone, that in every city, in every language, in every life being quietly lived right now, there is a mind measuring, comparing, wondering, not because people are small or afraid or broken, but because people are human, and being human has always meant carrying, somewhere close to the surface, the ancient and ordinary question of where you stand in the story of the world. You were never the only one asking if you enjoyed this journey. Consider following the channel. There's much more being observed in silence, waiting to be seen.